you want to click the...
Yes. Does he move it?
I don't know, maybe Fiona needs to do it. Yeah, you have to use your finger and take the cursor across. Yeah, there we go. One of the earliest collections, written collections of the Buddha's teachings is the Dhammapada. It's a collection of over 400 verses. They're very short and they're kind of often in couplets. One is sort of pointing out the more unwholesome way of seeing things and then the more wholesome way of seeing things. And it kind of goes through, and it's often considered the most sort of straightforward, comprehensive and like original, closer to the actual teachings of the Buddha, the words of the Buddha. Of course, that doesn't make it necessarily any better or worse than teachings that have come to us over the 2,000 years after that, because each country has added, each country and also different centuries and different communities and their different cultural traditions have added and flavoured the way the Buddha's original words are presented to us. But it is kind of nice to go back and read and contemplate the very straightforward way in which the Buddha taught and how those, it's said that the monks and the nuns, different ones became sort of specialists at memorizing certain types of teachings that the Buddha taught. They would memorize them and then they would teach other monks after the Buddha passed into parinirvana. They would teach other monks and nuns who then would memorize, and that went on for quite a few generations until it was written down. And then once it was written down, monks and nuns also specialized in memorizing the written teachings and being able to share those and teach those. And that's how we're able to have this fairly continuous thread of the teachings all the way through to today. And I have a couple of different translations. This little book I have, it's one of the Penguin Classics. It's one of the very first books that I got when I became interested, and the pages are all kind of yellow and crisp, and they've all come apart, like they're all loose. And this is only half the book. It only goes to 298. The rest have been lost. But it's kind of nice to feel this book, and it's got my old phone numbers. And I was like, oh gosh, I remember having that phone number. And then on the next page, oh, there's another phone number I had. When people used to write their names and their phone numbers in books. I don't think people do that so much anymore. So the very first verse. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows him as the wheel of the cart follows the beast that draws the cart. And then the second one, which is the couplet to it. What we are today comes from our thoughts of yesterday, and our present thoughts build our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. If a man speaks or acts with a pure mind, joy follows him as his own shadow. And then a different translation. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought and this is like wrought, as in wrought iron, something that's shaped by something. So thoughts are all mind-shaped. They are all mind-wrought. If with an impure mind a person speaks or acts, suffering follows him as the cart follows the ox. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-wrought. If with a pure mind a person speaks or acts, happiness follows him like his never departing shadow. I think this is probably, it's not an accident that it's the very first writings in this famous collection. Probably one of the most valuable things for us to contemplate is that our thoughts that we are having completely and utterly shape our experience of the world, our interpretation of the world, and of how we understand ourselves, and also they actually influence the world. They influence what happens in the world. The way that we think impacts the way that we speak, which impacts the way that we act. And when we interact, we cause reactions. Every action we do causes a reaction of some sort. Could be extremely minor, like not even noticeable. Could be very noticeable. It could be positive, it could be negative, it could be neutral, but every action, including our speech, has some kind of an effect. There is a reaction. So if we really contemplate the power of mind as distinct and somewhat different to the tendency, I think, for people to think their actions are most important. What am I doing? What should I be doing? What are they doing? What should they be doing? We tend to, I think, focus on what's visible, and what's visible is the body with 2 arms and 2 legs, generally speaking. That's what's visible. And so we look at that, we look at what people are doing, we look at what we are doing. And maybe even more so now in the very sort of materialist world that we live in recent centuries, is also what do we have, and what's happening with what we have, the objects around us and the way we interact with them, how our bodies interact with objects, has become very central to people. Because the mind is a little invisible, like it's all happening, the thoughts are happening inside our heads. But really, as it says, mind is the chief. Mind. So it might be helpful to think a little bit about a slightly different way of thinking about thoughts and mind. There's the thoughts that we have, just the thoughts that we have, with the content of those thoughts. I feel hot, I feel cold. This is good, this is bad, just the thoughts with whatever the content is of the thoughts. And then sometimes the way mind is used is more like the meta thought. The mind, the thought that watches the thought that notices, I feel cold. The thought that notices, I have the thought, I am hungry. And then we can also kind of expand out even further to a kind of another way in which mind is used sometimes, like with awareness, not just individual awareness, but a kind of a collective awareness. If we think of all the animals, including ourselves, we're all kind of thinking, thoughts are happening, and actions are following. And you can think of all of that collectively as a kind of collective mind, or collective awareness. And sometimes if we want to include all the non-sentient beings like mountains and rivers, we can think of them as a sort of functioning with an intelligence, in that they are functioning in accord with the laws of nature. They're functioning in accord. Mountains erode the way mountains erode, and rivers flow the way rivers flow. Rivers don't flow in the way that, say, mud flows. They flow differently. Mountains made of rock function differently to glaciers. So they're all functioning with a kind of intelligence. All of that together is sometimes called mind. And it's like each of us is part of that mind. And this mind is the chief of the thoughts. But most people, I think, tend to think that their thoughts are the thing. I am who I am, and these are my thoughts, and that's kind of it. We identify just there. So in Zazen, we observe our thoughts. We notice we have thoughts. We notice that we have them. We notice what they are. And one thing that we're cultivating is to notice in a kind of dispassionate way. It's kind of like kind of dispassionate in that we have the precepts and we have our ethical guidelines, our compass of wanting to be of benefit, wanting to be wholesome. So we observe ourselves dispassionately, but also noting at the same time, is this thought likely to lead to wholesome actions, or is this thought likely to lead to unwholesome actions? Is this thought likely to bring me peace of mind and bring peace of mind to others, or is this thought likely to cause agitation in my mind and possibly agitation to others? Does this thought lead me to feel alienated or separate from another? Does this thought limit my capacity to be empathic to another? Or does it increase my capacity to be empathic to another? So even observing thoughts and making judgments like that, we can kind of do that dispassionately. It's dispassionate in that we're not going, God, I'm so annoyed with myself, or I'm so proud of myself. It doesn't have the emotional kind of charge. It's just, I can see that this thought is making me feel quite uncomfortable. I wonder if there's a different way to think about this or to make sense of something. I do that with myself a lot. If I have a thought and I can feel that the thought causes a kind of just a slight constriction in my body, usually it's constriction, which is a slight lack of empathy in some way. If it does that just a little bit, then at that moment, if I am able, just try and pull back a little bit. So part of Zazen is us getting used to what our thoughts are, and then how to relate to them. The example that's given often with the Dhammapada, there's little stories that it's not in this collection that I have, but there are other collections that have little stories that illustrate the teaching. And so one of the illustrations for this first couplet is of two men, and of course, it's always gendered, but we'll just not worry about that. So two men both get sent off to go and visit a place and report back what it was like. So off they go, and one of them has a tendency towards kindness and generosity of spirit and general peace of mind. And so when he comes back, he reports, the people there, really delightful, very caring, very generous, much the same as we are here, and something like that. And then, as you can well imagine the way the story would go, the other person, who had a tendency to be kind of judgmental and gruff and suspicious about other people, went off to the same land not that they knew it was the same land, and came back with stories of how rude people were, how selfish they were, how unhospitable they were to him, much like the people here. And so not only, this is what's important, I think, to consider, is not only was it the lens with which they were seeing the people in the other land, like the way they were interpreting how other people were being, it was that, but additionally to that, it was because they viewed people in a particular way. The way they acted and the way they spoke influenced the way those people acted and spoke. And so tragically, those people end up confirming for you your preconceived notion of how they are. It's incredibly tragic that people do this and then are not recognising that they're a player in the drama. They're not recognising that they're contributing to the thing that they're criticising. They don't recognise that. And so they actually think the people there are rude and not hospitable and so on. They think that's actually so. They're not understanding that not only is their mind colouring how they're viewing people, but is influencing how people actually behave. And this is this teaching, with our minds we make the world. Sometimes people think that that's something incredibly mysterious, but actually it's just this repetition, infinite numbers of times that we're all participating in, constantly, all day, every day. We're interpreting the world and we're acting in a certain way, and whatever we interact with responds to us and creates a kind of a cycle where, if we're approaching things in a way that's alienating and with a strong sense of ourself as a separate entity and them as separate entities, if we've got this strong sense of separateness and reifying each person and each animal as this particular thing separate from every other thing, then we actually bring that quality out often in the other. We bring it out in them and then confirm that for ourselves, and not only confirm it for ourselves, but maybe are confirming it for them. So we're actually harming someone subtly in multiple ways when we think these unwholesome thoughts. And the opposite is true, of course, as well. If we approach people with a sense of, you are beautiful and you are perfect just as you are, and I'm so glad to be in your company. When we approach people like that, authentically, not as a performance, but actually we feel that, even if they might be a little bit prickly people, but still if we approach them with that sense, it might bring out in them a little bit of their less prickliness, because underneath everybody's prickliness or their anger or whatever it might be, underneath all of that is their true joyous self. So we might bring that out a little bit in them. And then they might share that a little bit with somebody else and so on. So we are creating each other. We are actually creating each other with our minds. The mind is the chief. The mind is the boss. And I think if we really deeply trust that that's the case, then Zazen, we see, this is why Zazen is so valuable. Because this is one of the only places where you can give all your attention to just your mind. The body is in its posture. It knows what to do. We've done it for hundreds and hundreds of hours. Our body sits in its posture. And then we can turn the light around and observe the mind. We can observe the mind hearing the birds. And there's also a kind of a place of simply just hearing the birds and not even particularly noticing that we're hearing them. Like the childlike way, children just have no sense of themselves. They're just simply marveling at things. We can do that too. But because we've developed such a strong identification with ourself having a name, and being this particular thing, we have to kind of work at undoing that, to return to that natural childlike wonder. But we can have that natural childlike wonder. But we usually have to work to undo some of the mess first before we can have that. Another example of how our mind influences things. When I used to live in Santa Cruz, it was a small enough city that people felt quite confident to have opinions about the whole of the city and all of the people in it. It's always rather amazing that people can have whole opinions about everybody. Everybody here is. It was a small enough city that people felt it was okay to do that. So everybody here. And I would hear different, really very conflicting, totally different opinions. Oh, people in Santa Cruz, the way they drive, they just so pushy, or something like that, And then other people saying, oh, so much better being in Santa Cruz. People are so polite here compared to LA, or something like that. And all these different opinions. And of course, it's the majority of that is just how our mind is selecting what it pays attention to. It's just our mind selecting what it pays attention to and what meaning it imbues to it. And the critical thing is believing it, people believing it. We view things selectively. We can't help but view things selectively. There's too much information. So we do view selectively. We can also cultivate a kind of a curiosity, so that habit of what we view, what we choose to notice, we can soften that habit so that we start to notice different things. So coming into a space like here at this temple that's filled with so much visual stimulus, it's just extraordinary. One thing I like to do when I arrive here is just practice looking somewhere that I don't normally look. It's just a simple little thing. I've done this for years. Just I tend to like to look at, say, the lotus flowers on the side of the building that are carved. So when I come here and my eye goes there, I then see if I can get my mind just to drop to something that I haven't seen before until I see something and think, oh, look at that. Oh, that's interesting. Haven't noticed that before. So we can actually learn to have a less rigid habit of mind in just what we notice. And it makes life so much more interesting. It's just all these things to keep on noticing in the world. I'll read the next two short verses. He insulted me, he hurt me, he defeated me, he robbed me. Those who think such thoughts will not be free from hate. He insulted me, he hurt me, he defeated me, he robbed me. Those who think not such thoughts will be free from hate. So that is fairly straightforward, self-explanatory. And it doesn't mean, of course, that if somebody does hurt us, we can have the thought, ow, that hurt, emotionally or physically, that hurt. Of course it makes sense. We're not kind of robots. We're going to notice if somebody says something that hurts a little bit, and we can feel a little ouch. It's a little hurtful. Or they kick us in the shins. Oh, that really hurt. Nobody's done that to me. But, it does happen to people. It doesn't mean not to have that initial thought. It's what do we dwell on? What do we dwell on? People dwell, often to their own detriment on how they've been harmed by somebody. They dwell on it and dwell on it. And that dwelling on it, as it says here, will not, the minds will not be free from hate. And it doesn't have to be hate in a really intense kind of hate, but just a kind of general aversion or dislike or mean-spiritedness towards someone. If we keep dwelling. We don't need to dwell on it. We need to take care of matters. If somebody is likely to want to keep kicking us in the shin, it's probably a good idea for us to not spend time with that person. But we don't have to keep thinking about it. We just rearrange our life somewhat in whatever way we need to. I'm using obviously a simple example, but there could be far more complex examples that we could all think of. So we do our best to not be harmed by other people, and then we don't dwell on it. And one way to not dwell on it is to just fairly simply, as we have quite often talked about, go through a process of thinking, this person behaved this way because of the causes and conditions in their life, and I don't need to know what they are. I can just trust that the causes and conditions of their life, all the things that have happened throughout their whole life, have led them to be somebody that harms others. There we go. It's really, we don't need to dwell on it. We just need to know that's the case, and then we just let that go. And let that go. So those that don't dwell on being the victim of circumstances and being the victim of others, those who don't dwell on that and don't dwell on how mean and unkind and terrible that other person is, those who do not dwell on those two perspectives, they are free from hate. They're free from hate and all of the variations, the milder variations of hate. They're free from that. And it's a wonderful thing to be completely free from that. It really is fantastic to be free from that, to not have mean feelings towards people, mean thoughts about people. And we can be somewhere along that continuum. We don't have to leap from one end to the other. We just keep practicing, and we find that over time we seem to not have ill feelings towards other people. They just slowly just go away until one day we sort of notice, I don't seem to have them at all. Or maybe I have them they just arise for a few seconds, and then I know how to dissipate them. When they arise for a few seconds, a little constriction happens, I know to just go, causes and conditions of what caused that for that person. And we respectfully, of course, always has to be respectfully. And any ill feeling just fades away. And this next line, I think, is kind of very famous. It's translated in lots of different ways, but you hear it all over the place, well outside of Buddhist circles. For hate is not conquered by hate. Hate is conquered by love. This is a law eternal. This is frequently quoted in various ways, and particularly in relation to war. You don't solve conflict with a neighbouring country or another country by crushing them. That will just lead to further conflict. Diplomacy is always the way. And the one that goes with that is, many do not know that we are here in this world to live in harmony. Those who know this do not fight against each other. So always looking for solutions, always looking for ways to resolve conflict, and sometimes the only resolution in some situations is simply to remove oneself from it. Sometimes we can't actually solve it, we just have to remove ourselves from the situation. This translation is quite different that I have over here. I like this one. I'll read the two of them. Hate is never appeased by hate in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. This is a law eternal. So that's very similar. But this one, I really like the way it's translated here. There are those who do not realize that one day we all must die. But those who do realize this settle all quarrels. I really like that. There are those who do not realize that one day we all must die. but those who do realize this settle all quarrels. Because we all know cognitively that we're all going to die, but on a practical daily level, people tend to forget. We tend to forget. I think we often forget that other people are going to die. We think of them as just like they're going to be eternally harmful. We've got to do something about them. They're going to just be harmful forever. But it is good to remember, you know what, they're also going to die. Not so that we're complacent, but so that a little bit of like compassion and recognition of ourself in them can come forward. They are going to die, just as I am going to die. So even someone for whom we have strong conflict, if we can just remember they are going to die just as I am going to die, can just help soften a judgmental mind. Mind is the chief. I think this gets confirmed for us too through our practice. After years of practice, we really start to notice, my goodness, now my thoughts are not the boss of me. It's like I, mind, and the boss of my thoughts. This is what mind is the chief is saying. Mind is the chief over thoughts. Rather than the thoughts pull me along through my life, all my emotions just drag me about, cluttering up my mind, disturbing my sleep, disturbing my peace. The thoughts just keep on happening. Can't stop thinking about this thing. You know, often people have this experience. All of us have this experience in our lives. But over time with practice, actually that does really quieten down. It really quietens down. And I think one of the reasons people stay with practice for years and decades is that they feel the result. They really notice the result. They notice that they can more easily sleep at night, even when there's stresses. Not always, but more often. And they can put something aside when it needs to be put aside. Got something I have to do, some work commitment, something that needs to be attended to. I need to put that trouble aside. When we're able to put it aside, because mind is the chief. Mind is the boss, not the little thoughts themselves with all the content. They're not the boss. They're just thoughts. I'll just read this last couplet and then we can finish. He who lives only for pleasures and whose soul is not in harmony, who considers not the food he eats, is idle and has not the power of virtue, such a man is moved by Mara, is moved by selfish temptations, even as a weak tree is shaken by the wind. So this sort of weak tree shaken by the wind, it's like mind not being able to manage the thoughts. But he who lives not for pleasures and whose soul is in self-harmony, who eats or fasts with moderation and has faith and the power of virtue, this man is not moved by temptations, as a great rock is not shaken by the wind. So we want to be like that, sitting like a boulder. Sometimes I think of us as sitting like a boulder, but it's like a transparent boulder because there is no self. So it's like this boulder, like a mountain, but it's also transparent, like a glass mountain. I'll read this one's translation here. Just as a storm throws down a weak tree, so does Mara overpower a person who lives in the pursuit of pleasures, who is uncontrolled in their senses, immoderate in eating, indolent and dissipated. Just as a storm cannot prevail against a rocky mountain, So Mara can never overpower the person who lives meditating on the impurities, who is controlled in his senses, moderate in eating, and filled with faith and earnest effort. I think it's interesting that eating is used here because probably back in the Buddha's time, people didn't acquire great possessions anyway, that the way in which people would overindulge would be to overindulge in food. But in our modern society, people do overindulge in food. But we can overindulge in all sorts of other things. Like so many other things we can overindulge in. We can have way too many clothes in our closet or too many cars in our driveway if we're wealthy. Too many things. Or consuming too much media. So there's lots of ways. But back in the Buddha's time it was probably fairly straightforward to not eat too much, share with others and eat in moderation. So we can do the same. We can just live in moderation, live simply. It's a bit hard to live simply in modern times, but we can do our best to live simply. And that way we can be like a mountain that the wind doesn't buffet around, rather than a weak tree that's shaken continuously by the wind. Yeah. All right. I might stop there. Would anyone like to ask a question or comment? I'll just turn off the recording.